Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. This is the final GAP food safety training supported by a specialty crop block grant from the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. You can learn more about PASA's upcoming events on our website at pasafarming.org. My name is Michelle Spencer, Membership Director with PASA. Also with me today is Tracy Raymond. Tracy has been working for PASA over the last several months on the grant I mentioned and was key in pulling this webinar together. Tracy will be moderating the question and answer segment at the end of the presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of the interface that you should see up on the right-hand side of your screen. You're listening in your computer's speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. All participants are currently muted. We did have a few participants in previous webinars that had some issues with their computer audio. So if you are experiencing any challenges right now, please try switching to the telephone option first. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing those into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address most of them during a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. This session is being recorded and will be posted on PASA's YouTube page for future viewing. I also want to point out that there are a few handouts that our presenters have offered for download today. Over on the right-hand pane, you should see a section that says handouts, and you can download those documents from that area of your pane. There will also be a few polling questions that our presenters will ask during the course of the presentation. And so now I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Jeff Stoltzfus. Jeff has spent the past 22 years working as an adult educator with the Eastern and Lancaster County School District, working mostly with commercial produce farmers and also working with agronomy, dairy, nutrient management regulations, and other general issues affecting farmers. For the past 5 years, he has worked closely with the food safety issue as it has emerged, and he has helped farmers develop food safety plans, prepared them for audits, and educated them on good agricultural practices. During the past 2 years, he has been involved with a group GAP pilot program through USDA and the Wallace Center. He also serves on the food safety education team, a group of produce auction leaders from across the East and Midwest. Very recently, Jeff joined the Penn State Cooperative Extension as the farm food safety educator. And now I will turn things over to Jeff. Jeff, you should be
there we go.
in control there. There you go.
Okay, now I got it. Sorry. All right, thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so as we get started, there's going to be a few polling questions here. Let me get my slideshow up. Just to get an idea kind of the background of the audience. I have, as I mentioned, I've been working with growers in Eastern Lancaster County over the past 5 years. And so my experiences are based on those growers. What I've found with food safety is that experiences vary wildly from grower to grower, depending on the size and the complexity of what they're trying to grow and market. So today I'm going to talk mostly about audits and what's involved, emphasizing mostly the cost. I don't want to go in detail into any particular audit system. I will probably touch on FSMA regulations, But mostly I'm going to focus on audits. And let me say up front, FSMA is the Food Safety Modernization Act. The regulations were just finalized here within, I guess, back in November. They do not require farmers to have audits. They will require many of the same things that the audits require, but they do not require you to have a third party come out and do an actual audit. That's entirely up to you and actually your buyer. So many folks are getting audits because their buyers are requiring it. But that's what I'm going to focus on today. So yeah, as we go through this, I guess we'll have an opportunity for questions at the end, and so we'll see how we do. But I just wanted to get a quick poll as we started, just to get the lay of the land here with the audience. Since I can't ask you to raise your hands, we'll do these polls. Did you get any results for me?
Yes, we do. I think we can go ahead and close it out. Remember, folks, the more people that answer the polling questions, the more information Jeff has to work with. But it looks like the 91% said no to your first polling question. So there you go.
Okay, so 91% do not have a third-party audit at this time. Okay, good.
And we have the answers coming in on the second one.
Okay.
We have 50% of the folks have voted so far. And currently we have about 70% that have voted, and it looks like about half have responded with no. They're not planning on having their first third-party audit soon. 27% have said yes, and 18% are not certain. So I think we can go ahead and close that one out too, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And, yep, and I'm watching the last one here.
And the food safety training, and I assume a lot of people have heard about FSMA and food safety and the challenges that presents. I know going through that is one of the things they didn't mention is I also do a little farming on the side. I grow some strawberries and pumpkins, and so I tend to look at some of these things maybe from the farmer perspective. And I know it's a process when you're dealing with regulations to understand how it all works.
You definitely are from Lancaster County. You said pumpkins.
Pumpkins, yeah. I'll say a few other things as well.
I think we can go ahead and close this one out too. It looks like 69% of the folks said yes, they've been through a food safety training class.
Good. So you've been exposed to, a lot of you have been exposed to some of the issues that we're going to talk about today. So primarily we're going to focus, as I mentioned, on costs and what it costs to get an audit. And I guess the costs get broken into two areas. We'll talk a little bit about the cost of the audit itself, and then the cost of the things that you may have to do differently on the farm as a result of the audit. So typically for the farmers that I've worked with, a small farm, $500 is basically the starting price for audit. If you get into larger, more complex operations where you're growing 20 different crops, you're doing a lot of packing, you're washing produce, you have a number of employees, maybe a couple different farm sites, then you get into up to $5,000. And that's based, as I mentioned, on a number of factors. The audits are all done on a per hour basis, so the longer they have to spend there, the more time the higher the cost. And it also depends on the audit that's going to be required. First, I'm going to touch on just a little bit of some of the practices that may incur some costs. One of the things you need to have is a potable water source, potable for bacteria at least. So you need at least a well. Water for post-harvest handling, any washing has to be potable. Water for hand washing has to be potable, and water for employees to drink has to be potable. If you don't have a potable water source, and that means you have to put a treatment on, So that could cost you $1,000 for a UV light system. If your well is already in good shape, then that's not going to be an additional cost. In Lancaster County, we deal a lot with livestock and animals on our farms. Our farms are diversified, so there's dairy farms. Sometimes we have to look at where the animals are in relationship to the produce. I talked with a grower yesterday. We talked about putting a berm or diversion below his pasture and above his produce field to keep the water from running off of the barnyard or pasture into the fields. So that can be a cost depending on the situation. Packing house upgrades, I don't know where you pack. It doesn't have to be a fancy dedicated building, but depending on the situation there, you may need to change some surfaces. We don't like to see wood in packing house in produce contact surfaces, so sometimes that involves some cost adjustments as well. Equipment upgrades, sometimes I've been on farms where they were using an old packing line. Their sorting table was cracked and not a very good surface. They had to resurface that. Sometimes things as simple as fixing hydraulic lines on tractors. That's one of the things auditors look at. We don't like to be leaking hydraulic oil on our produce. Those are kind of things you would probably do anyway as general farm maintenance, but it's something you'd specifically have to do for a produce audit. So bathrooms and hand washing. You can use your bathroom for most audits, your home bathroom, if it's within a quarter mile of your fields. If your fields are more remote than that, then you're going to have to add porta pots or some other kind of facility. If you do that, then you have to add a hand washing station to go along with that. Worker training, all of your workers, including family members, will need to be trained in hand washing. Yes, we have to train people how to wash their hands. 20 seconds is what they require. There's some other items. Workers can't be in the field when they're sick, obviously, and some other things where your first aid kits are located and those kind of things. The farmers I work with can go through, they can do worker training for their family in 10 minutes. It's nothing terribly detailed, but it is something that has to be done and documented. There is some record keeping that goes along with it, and we'll talk about that. So there are some logs, some things that you'll need to keep. And this is true of a lot of industries. If you're a truck driver, you know about keeping logs. You know, dairy farmers need to keep logs. There's a lot of jobs out there where record keeping, logging things, it's become kind of the way of life, and that's becoming true for produce farmers as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. A food safety audit is risk-based, so they want you to assess the risk of your practices on your farm. So what that means is that they can't tell you exactly what you have to have. In some areas I can. In water, for example, obviously it has to be potable. But in terms of a packing shed, you have to assess the risk, like I mentioned, with your water system. With animals, you have to look at the animals on your farm and what kind of risk are they presenting. I can go into one farm with a 30-cow dairy and he's got all kinds of problems, risk with his animals and his produce. I can go down the road to the next farm and it's a 30-cow dairy with, you know, the same situation, and he doesn't have the risk just because of where the animals are located or the fields or whatever. So there's not a real boilerplate answer we can give you on a lot of questions. It's kind of the common sense approach. You have to look at your operations and say, is that really a risk for bacteria on my produce? You can have validation steps. For example, I work with some onion growers that use wooden bins, and we found a study out of Oregon State University where they said that wooden bins, they did a study comparing wood and plastic bins, and they saw very little difference on onions. So in that case, we continue to use wooden bins. If we were dealing with spinach or leafy greens, we may, that may not be viable, but for certain crops, that's fine. So there are some wiggle room for certain commodities that we're growing depending on the risk. So what are some of the food practices that, that may cost you money? Water tests will need to be done, and FSMA is going to kind of dictate this regardless of the audit standard. Water tests need to be done 1 to 5 times a year depending on your source and how it's used. Wells will need to be tested less than surface water. So that's going to add a couple $100 to your cost. As I mentioned, you need a potable water source for employees for washing produce. So if you don't have one, if you're on public water, of course, that's considered a potable source as long as your municipality is doing a good job of managing that. Wash water will need to have some kind of sanitizer on for the most part. So if you're using water in post-harvest washing, you'll need to use chlorine or Sanidate, which is a peroxide product to wash with. So I mentioned earlier, cleanable surfaces on the packing line. Wood is not considered sanitizable, so we need to have plastic or metal or something there that you can wash and sanitize. New packaging materials, we're trying to get away from old packaging materials. This was an issue on many farms, many CSA folks. You know, we like to recycle, but sometimes with something like produce packaging, it's probably not a good idea. Talked to some CSA farmers, you know, their customers will bring their boxes back, but they said, we really don't know where that box has been in the last week. Was the cat sleeping in it? Were the kids playing with it? We don't really know where that box has gone. So we've encouraged growers for the most part to use new packaging wherever they can. Or else if you're using an old box, put a plastic liner in there that you can put in there new each week. So to talk a little bit about the audits, there are a number of standards, different audits that you can have. Your buyer will probably dictate which ones they like. USDA GAP has been around the longest. That was developed by USDA several years ago. Many farms were getting requirements from buyers requesting 3 or 4 different audits, which got to be confusing and expensive. So they put together an initiative and came up with an audit called the Harmonized Audit, which took all these audits, of course, and kind of brought everything together to try and standardize it. So they came up with a very good audit that a lot of folks are using, but there's still buyers who say they need to have Primus or Canada GAP or GFSI. Most of the farmers I've worked with have gone to harmonized. That seems to be the compromise, the middle ground, and most buyers will accept harmonized. But there are certain buyers for certain crops will want a Primus audit or a Canada GAP audit or GSFI, which is Global Food Safety Initiative. I think I have the S and F turned around. But anyway, the Primus, the GFSI audits are more complicated and more expensive. So typical auditing costs, as I mentioned earlier, a harmonized or a GAP-GIP cost is going to be $500 to $2,000. PDA will cost share up to $400 a year for successful audits. So that is one effort to help out a little bit on the costs. But the challenge is small growers face a bigger cost. So I've worked with this onion growing co-op. They grow some other things, some squash as well, but we call them the onion co-op. So we had 80 growers. We're growing a total of 125 acres of onions. That's a lot for us. They marketed roughly 40 truckloads last year. The challenge we have is we had to have an auditor on every one of those 80 farms. So at $500 a farm, that's a cost of roughly $40,000. Now, if you would go down to Vidalia, Georgia right now to the onion farms and you went to a 125-acre onion farmer and he's growing 125 acres and he's essentially selling as many truckloads of onions as we are, he has one audit. So where our costs were running for 80, we had to have 80 audits at $40,000. He has one audit, which may cost him, I don't know, $5,000 if he's a larger operation. And there's growers down there, 125 acres is probably a small Vidalia onion grower. So you can see that the costs are much higher for small farmers because we're not spreading it over the same volume. So when I looked at it last year with our growers, we shipped 40 truckloads. We had 80 audits. You do that math, that means that we had 2 audit visits for every truckload of onions that we shipped. And an audit is an inspection, but it's really a snapshot in time. It's not like the meat inspectors that they're there every day, they're processing meat. The auditor comes onto your farm one day for the summer. He sees what happens on that day. He doesn't see the rest of the growing season. But for our onions, we got 2 audits per truckload. That 125-acre onion farmer had 1 audit for 40 truckloads. So you can see our small growers actually have a much higher standard that we're complying with. Where we get 80 inspections for ours, he's only getting 1. So more of our onions were looked at. So how do we drive down those auditing costs? We've looked at a few things. As we mentioned earlier, I was on a group gap pilot the last 2 years. We played around with clustering. We played around with coordinated and single entity, and I'll describe these. Since we just started these in the last 2 years, we took the liberty of coming up with the names. I don't know if these names are official or not, but we made them official because nobody else was doing it. Group gap is it is actually a USDA audited scheme. This is a name we didn't come up with. USDA came up with this one. But USDA auditors will come out, and actually they subcontract to PDA, the Pennsylvania Department of Ag. But the group has to hire an internal auditor. So for example, the co-op, the onion co-op that I was talking about, they hired an internal auditor to go to each of the farms and do the audit. Then USDA came along and audited the square root of the number of growers we had. So with 80 growers, that's roughly 9 growers. So they came out and did a sort of a verification audit of our internal audit. The theory is that an internal auditor works cheaper than a USDA auditor. So yeah, if you have people in the group, in the co-op or whatever that can do that, that's where the cost savings come in. The group has to have what we call a quality management system, which is a big detailed plan that describes how the group functions together as a unit. It describes how we bring on new growers, what we do if there's a problem with one of our existing growers, how we add growers, how we delete growers that may have problems. And then that QMS has records and logs that needs to be part of that, training records, that kind of thing, and that QMS is audited. So what I found after 2 years is it doesn't really pay unless you have at least 35 growers in your group, because the cost of the QMS, the extra audits, the extra QMS development doesn't really pan out until you have at least 35 to 40 growers. And it requires significant administrative support. You need to have somebody in the office, the co-op, who has the ability to put all that together and manage it. Where we see it working a lot is with food hubs. Organic Valley out of Wisconsin has worked with the group gap, and they are continuing with it. So it can work just in certain situations. Clustering is a little bit different, so much simpler. We found that when we bring a couple farmers together to schedule an audit, we can do it cheaper. USDA charges $95 an hour, including from the time they leave the office. So if they come out to your farm and audit, and they have an hour to get there and an hour to go back, you're spending $200 just for their time on the road, plus 2 to 3 hours doing the audit. We found if we can put 3 farmers that live within a few miles of each other together, schedule that audit for one day, the auditors will spread that travel costs over the 3 growers, so that can save them, $100 each at least. That can save 4 hours of travel time, so there's $200 in savings. Plus we find the audits go a little bit quicker if there's 3 farmers together, because by the time they get to the 2nd or 3rd farmer, that farmer knows exactly what they're looking for, and so that kind of speeds everything up. We find it's best for growers. The first audit usually costs more because you don't know exactly what that auditor is asking for. If you have your paperwork filled out ahead of time and you're right on top of things, the audit goes much faster and is much cheaper. if you have to say, well, I have that form out in the barn, or that form I think is in my desk drawer, and if your desk is like mine and it takes you 10 minutes to find it, you know, that clock is ticking, so your costs kind of go up. So we find that farmers that have been through audits or have observed other audits, it goes much quicker. So you need to talk to your auditors ahead of time to schedule that. Then we have what we call coordinated audit. That's where 2 or 3 farmers are working kind of in a partnership to grow and market produce. With our onion growers, they're all growing the same crop, so they have very similar plans. And we said, you know, if there's 2 brothers and they're on adjoining farms and they're sharing labor and some other things, maybe equipment, maybe we can combine them and make them 2 farms look like 1 farm to an auditor. Not that we're trying to deceive the auditors, but let's just think of those 2 farms as though as 1 farm, and those guys are working in partnership. And so that can, of course, drive the cost of the audit in half because you're only doing 1 audit instead of 2. The downside of that is that you're going to pass or fail together. So if you have a neighbor who you're not real confident in his food safety abilities, you may not want to hitch your wagon to his audit because if he could bring you down. But that is an option, and I've seen it work with brothers who have gone together and said, hey, let's just grow these onions in 1 field and we'll split the costs together, something like that. Then we've played around with this idea of single entity where 1 co-op that a co-worker of mine has worked with actually provides the supplies and the inputs, the seed. They have central packing and distribution. The farmers are essentially just subcontractors to that co-op. They all get paid, of course, according to the crop they bring in. But that whole co-op is just managed as 1 large farm. And so then, again, we could just make it one co-op. Or, for example, if I would decide to grow 50 acres of watermelons and I would contract with 10 farmers to grow those for me, and I would supply the plants and make sure that everybody had their water tested and all that, maybe that could be done as 1 co-op. Or as 1 audit. If you do that or any of these other ideas, certainly be sure to check that with your auditor ahead of time to make sure that that works. I have a few minutes, so before I tackle my summary, I just want to take a look at some pictures. Pictures are always worth 1,000 words. When people are trying to get their head around what an audit would mean to me, it's always easy to look at some pictures of what we found on farms. This was kind of a packing room that we found on 1 farm. It's downstairs of a barn. If you look off to the left, there's actually an animal feedlot over there. This area was just kind of partitioned off. This doesn't work very well. There's bird nests there near the top. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but up here there's some bird nests. That's one of the things we look for in packing facilities. Make sure there's no bird intrusion, make sure there's no pets, no mice, no rats. Dust was falling down through the cracks in the ceiling. We told this farmer that even though he has his boxes covered here with cardboard, which is good, some of them here are not. So we told this farmer he would need to put a ceiling in there to deal with the bird issues, to keep the birds out, probably a partition there to separate it from the animals on the left. And the floor was another issue as well. I came back the next year, so instead of spending $700 or $800 in trying to fix up this room, he just went and built a brand new packing shed. Took me around the back of the barn the next year and said, this is where we pack now. And he had a new 50 by 80 building. So for him, the costs were pretty significant, but he felt as his business was growing, he needed to do that not just from a food safety standpoint, but from an efficiency standpoint. And he needed more room for equipment storage in the winter anytime. Anyway, this is another, again, we talk about bin storage. How do you store your harvest containers? We don't have to spend a lot of money on these things. This is just an example where somebody built some shelves to keep them up off the ground. So a lot of these things don't have to cost a lot of money. So it kind of varies. We've had folks pack, and you don't have to have a packing shed. I've seen small growers make this kind of system work where they have a canopy or a little cover like this. It's relatively temporary. Again, we would look for birds, and when you look at that roof, there's that ceiling, there's not many opportunities there for birds. It's pretty open. The floor drains, you can see the pipes going down into the ground, so apparently there's pipes underneath the ground here, so it's taking away a lot of the moisture. So it doesn't have to be expensive. Bathrooms do not have to be expensive. This one meets all the criteria. Has a sink, has a single wash, hand towels, soap dispenser, signs that all workers must wash their hands before returning to the fields, the first aid kit, and that's a perfectly good hand wash facility. This is just an example of folks packing outside. It looks like there is some sort of roof there based on the shadows, but something like this can work. It doesn't have to be a fancy building. This is an example of some of the things we don't like to see. This is a screen that they use to rinse some greens on, probably. They put them on, this is just the corner of it. We don't like to see wood. Wood tends to harbor bacteria. You can't sanitize these kind of areas between the pieces of wood here, so we would encourage guys to get away from some of those kind of things. So I guess in summary, if I can find my summary slide here again, food safety audit costs can be a little more, can be disproportionately higher on small farmers, just as a result of the audit and the fact that you're not spreading it over as many units. Audit standards are risk-based. They allow for some flexibility, but you have to take a look at the risk. And so you think in terms of risk reduction, not necessarily cost reduction. As farmers, we all try to figure out how to do things cheaply. That comes as part of our nature. But I think the first thing you need to do is look at your practices and say which of these are a risk for bacterial contamination. And then what's a good cost-effective way to go about reducing that risk. And it may mean you got to build a building. In many cases, it just means you need to repair some things, maybe move your vegetable fields around. So there's a lot of low-cost ways to manage these problems. When it comes to reducing the audit costs, try to work together with your neighbors and other growers. Small farmers have been having to do that for years, but that's one way to drive down some of those costs. And then attend mock audits. We try to do some of those throughout the summer. I know PASA has done some, Extension has done some, PDA likes to do those. It gives you a good idea of exactly specifically what an auditor is looking for. The harmonized audit, for example, is 80 questions. I can't really go through that today, but if you go to a mock audit, you can hear a little bit of what those auditors are looking for on a regular farm. And if you need more help in writing food safety plans, which I didn't touch on at all, that's probably the first thing you need to do before you get audited. Our website at Penn State has some information. There's many other websites around as well. Michigan State has a very good website that's available. So yeah, with that, I'm probably close to the end of my time. We could probably take a few quick questions if there would be some out there.
Okay, I just want to remind our attendees that if you do have questions, you can enter them at any time during the presentation, and you do so by, you should see on your dashboard a panel that says questions, and you can just go ahead and type in your questions there. I think for now we're just going to move on to Nikki. Michelle?
Yes, Jeff, so if you can go ahead and transition the presenter control, I'll do the introduction of Nikki. So we're now going to introduce some panelists that are going to detail some ways to actually mitigate some of the costs associated with GAP that Jeff was just detailing. Our first presenter is Nikki Shingle. She is the Director of Charitable Relations for Everence. Everence has offices in Ephrata, Lancaster, Mountjoy, and Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. And she's part of a team of advisors in the Lancaster and Central Pennsylvania areas. Before 2010, Nikki worked as a planned and major gifts officer for WITF, Central Pennsylvania's public broadcasting station. Having served at Messiah College, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, WITF, in Everett, Nikki has over 10 years experience in fundraising and philanthropic planning. Nikki is a board member at Friendship Community. She serves on the PR and Development Committee at the Occupational Development Center in Lancaster. In addition, Nikki is a member of the Tell High Retirement Community Development Committee and Garden Spot Village Planned Giving Advisory Council. So we'll turn things over to Nikki.
Nikki, can we get you to go full screen? Sorry.
Not sure how to do that. Did that work?
That was the opposite.
Oh, okay. I don't have an option for a full screen on my panel. Can you at least see the slide?
Yes. Is it just up in the upper right?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
On your computer screen, there should be a thing to minimize, max, and close. Okay, we can just continue.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. So Tracy had invited me to share about ways that we can make contributions and that we as Everett support farmers in their charitable giving. And Lancaster is probably one of our most generous areas in the country, in the parts of the country that we serve as Everett. And farmers have really taken advantage of some of the unique giving opportunities that are available. And we see folks giving grain, livestock, honey, milk, corn, soybeans. We also have folks who gift percent interest in their farm when they're transitioning ownership, or probably a decade or so ago, many farmers were selling to developers, and there were lots of generous gifting opportunities that happened that way. So what we want to focus on during this part of the call here today is on the gifts of commodities. And I just wanted to share a few of the advantages with you that are associated with gifts of commodities. And that would be that the farmers have the opportunity to deduct the cost of producing the commodity. They have the opportunity to reduce their self-employment tax, and then obviously the best advantage is they get to support their favorite charities. I'll share a little bit about how that process works, and then we'll come back to some of the advantages just to give a little bit more of the details there. A lot of our farmers throughout the country recognize that they're going to have some years where they have higher earning years and some years that are lower earning years, depending on lots of factors, including the weather, and just a lot of factors impact what their situation looks like from year to year. And so some of our farmers want to be generous all the years, in the good years and the bad years. And so one of the ways to kind of level and stabilize charitable giving is by creating a donor-advised fund. And a donor-advised fund is really just like a charitable, it's like a charitable checking account, essentially. And many of the community or religious foundations in your area, community foundations, Everett has a charitable foundation, they can establish a donor-advised fund for individuals. And then those commodities can be gifted into that donor-advised fund and then available for the farmers to make distributions from that fund to favorite charities in the future. And so what that essentially does is, in a year where earnings are really high and there's extra opportunity to be generous, they can fund that account more heavily those years, and then years where the income might not be as high, they have those resources saved to continue to be generous. So the donor advised fund is a really flexible tool for charitable giving, for gifts of commodities. But you can gift commodities directly to a charity. It doesn't have to go into a foundation. And so the slide here talks about how it works. You can notify the charity of your intent to give, and it's important that you notify the charity in advance of making the sale. The IRS wants to be sure that the notification of the gift happens before the sale. And then at the foundation, we ask those farmers to act as our agent and sell that commodity to their buyer. And so the buyer would then write the check out to Mennonite Foundation, which is the name of our foundation, and they send the check and either the scale ticket or the auction receipt to us, and then we can deposit that check, that gift, into the donor advised fund account that the farmer owns. And this is really valuable for a couple of reasons. We'll go back to the advantages slide here. Farmers can actually deduct the cost of producing that commodity from the production cost. And even if they don't, if you don't itemize your deductions on your tax return, you can still benefit by reducing your net income, which can save money. And then the third advantage here that's interesting to point out is that tax laws permit donors they allow you to deduct up to 50% of your taxable income as cash contributions. So all individuals have the ability to make charitable deductions of cash of up to 50% of their adjusted gross income. And that seems like a lot, but we have some farmers, some very generous farmers in our area who actually would give more than that. And gifting farm commodities does not impact, because it's not in the form of cash, it's not limited to the 50%. So they could give 50% of their adjusted gross income and have some commodities gifted into their donor advised fund that doesn't limit being able to hit that 50% threshold. So there are lots of possibilities for generosity with farm commodities, and they can go directly to charities or be given into donor advised funds to help with future giving years. And I wanted to give a couple of examples. We have a client who regularly, every month, he has a milk check that comes to the foundation and is deposited into his account. And so it's very steady giving, it's very strategic, and that seems to work really smoothly. It gives him a steady flow of income into that fund to give from. And then in 2015, we had a number of farmers gift eggs. As you may know, with the avian flu, there was high demand for eggs, and that drove the cost up, the price of eggs up. And in addition, the cost to feed the chickens was lower than normal. So some of these farmers had higher levels of earnings than they had in previous years, and it was a great opportunity for them to be really generous. And so we saw a number of farmers opening donor advised funds to gift eggs, taking advantage of this special year. So those are some of the things that I was hoping to share with you about gifting farm commodities, and I would be happy to take some questions. I know that Jay is planning to share some similar things as well in the next round of this. So Michelle, did any questions come through while I was talking?
Yeah, this is Tracy. Nikki, we do. I have somebody asked if our company wants to look further into working with Everence for commodity donations, who should they speak to?
That's a great question. You can actually reach out to me directly, or there is a handout that is posted in conjunction with this webinar that would have an 800 number on the back of it. You could also call that number to reach someone with the foundation that can help you get started with giving.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Nikki.
Okay.
And just as a reminder, those handouts should be available in your dashboard off to the right hand of the screen. You can download those. And we'll send those also in the follow-up email to the attendees. So if all the presenters want to share their contact information, we can send it out that way to everyone as well. Nikki, if you can transfer control over to Jay, we'll move into that portion. Jay Uri of the Gleaning Project of South Central Pennsylvania has past experience in logistics and sustainable agriculture and research experience in community food access. The Gleaning Project is a regional nonprofit effort to reduce food loss on local farms and orchards and improve food security in Franklin and Adams counties. In 2015, the Gleaning Project overall saved 300,000 pounds of fresh local produce from 80 donating farms, orchards, and gardens. Those fresh fruits and vegetables were distributed for free to over 23,000 community members in need with the help of 79 distributing community partners. The Gleaning Project is out to create a model for similar counties to adopt. So we'll send things over to Jay.
Cool, thank you. This is Jay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Excellent. Cool. Okay, so yes, like Michelle said, this is Jay. I coordinate the Franklin County chapter of the Gleaning Project of South Central Pennsylvania. Quick definition. Gleaning basically means saving fruits and vegetables from going to waste or getting lost on farms and orchards, and then getting that good food to those in need. The Gleaning Project is a community solution, and basically what we're trying to do is reduce that food loss and improve food security overall in South Central Pennsylvania. So my goal today is to provide just one example of the possibilities that exist with gleaning, and then answer any questions that attendees might have. So if we could start with a question, I'm curious with this audience, what obstacles might prevent you from working with a gleaning organization? And I think we have a poll question for that.
Yes, I just opened that up for everyone.
And the question I most often ask is, who knows what gleaning is? And I'm often, the frequent response is that a lot of people, I don't know, don't know what gleaning is, or don't know that it's happening, or that the possibilities are so large. So I'm really happy to present today about this and try and get some more balls rolling on gleaning in our region.
If we could have a few more people vote, that'd be awesome. But I can tell you right now, Jay, it looks like 17% are saying liability concerns, 17% are worried about the extra time, 17% don't think it's worth it, and 50% are saying other.
Oh, nice, good. Maybe when we're done we can follow up and see what the other might be. I would be really curious to see. Cool, thank you. So moving forward, the Gleaning Project, our Gleaning Project, the Gleaning Project of South Central Pennsylvania, is part of a larger nonprofit called South Central Community Action Programs, or we call it SCAP. SCAP is a nonprofit with a mission to empower families and engage the community to pursue innovative and effective solutions to break the cycle of poverty. So poverty is our focus, and providing support and removing barriers is our work. And gleaning is just one way that we do that. So the screen shows probably 9 to 12 different programs that SCAP is operating, and the Gleaning Project is just one part of that whole. We've been saving food in Adams County for the last 6 years, and we expanded to Franklin County in 2014, and that's when I started here. So very briefly, because it must be said, we have 50 million people in the United States right now who are hungry. 50 million is approximately the total population of Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey, and Ohio combined. Excuse me. So approximately the population of 6 major mid-Atlantic states is what we have in terms of hunger in the United States right now. Ballpark, that's about 1 in 5 United States children about 1 in 7 adults. By hungry, I mean food insecure, which means having limited or uncertain access to enough food for an active, healthy life. And I think that number is really unacceptable. I think everyone would agree. I also believe that it's unnecessary and that it hurts all of us. So I don't think that gleaning will completely solve hunger. Hunger is a result of poverty, and poverty is a really complex problem. But gleaning fresh fruits and vegetables for immediate distribution, like these pictures are demonstrating, to those in need does reduce hunger, and even more importantly, it greatly improves nutrition for those receiving that produce. This picture is one of my favorites. This is really what we're striving for with the gleaning project. So this was a box of produce that came, an eater or a recipient came and picked up in the month of August. So that's one family taking home a quart of, perfect heirloom sauce tomatoes, a pint of mixed cherries, probably about 2 pounds of peaches, a pound of summer squash, a pound of cucumbers. There's chard and there's kale there. And all of that food would have otherwise gone to waste in Franklin County. But instead, a young lady with 2 kids who needed food was able to choose those fruits and vegetables and take them home and enjoy them with her family. And that's exactly what we're looking for, what we're working towards. So speaking very briefly about food loss on farms, this is a picture from an orchard in Franklin County. On-farm food loss ranges anywhere from 1 to 20%. No one really knows. It varies a lot. It's really specific to each individual farm. It could be as much as 30% sometimes with certain crops or in a bad year. So reasons for this are grade defects, condition defects, drops, culls, market leftovers, market price fluctuation. Could be the last planting that still has plenty of good food in it, but you lack the time or the labor or the market to pick it for. I know pretty much everyone has extra, and the gleaning project gleans from the 2nd largest grower here in Franklin County, which has that's loading dock scale and 53-foot reefer trailers, all the way down to backyard gardens. I could very easily talk about the gleaning project for hours. It's pretty much what I do every day. It's probably why I talk fast. I'll try and talk slower, but basically our model is just one way of running a gleaning organization. So I'll just speak about it very briefly to talk about some of the potential that exists. So in Franklin and Adams counties, gleaning project staff, which is either 1 or 2 paid positions, and lots of volunteers, glean in fields and pick up from packing houses. We distribute immediately or as soon as possible to our community partner locations. So our community partners include food pantries, free community meals, shelters, senior centers, and after-school education programs that are working with low-income youth. Anyone that's trying to reduce hunger or improve nutrition or alleviate poverty in Franklin or Adams County is a potential partner with us, and we are trying to figure out how to work with them. Speaking for Franklin County, last year I worked with 19 farms and 20 gardeners. We gleaned 80,000 pounds of food, and we distributed almost all of it with the help of about 30 community partner points of distribution. And these are the folks that we worked with last year. So, essentially, right, so these are our partners. Last year we had about 7% loss between what we gleaned and what we were able to distribute to families, which is pretty good, but also peanuts. When I compare it to Adams and Franklin County combined, so Adams County has a bit of a head start on Franklin County. Adams and Franklin County combined numbers are right here. The gleaning project was able to save 300,000 pounds of fresh fruits and vegetables from 80 farms and gardens. And this honestly is, from the limited experience that I have, really just the tip of the iceberg. That's why we're always looking to build more community partners, because I don't see a limit on the production side, at least the way that our food system works right now and the way that the market opportunities for those growers exist with that imperfect produce. There's no limit on the production side. Our limit is the nuts and bolts of the logistics and the number of community partners that we're linked to that we're delivering produce to. We have spreadsheets and quality standards and food safety protocols and standard operating procedures, just like any for-profit farm business. Essentially what we have is a mobile food hub that's aggregating and distributing donated produce with very little infrastructure on a mission to reduce hunger and improve nutrition. So I love to say that we enjoy the beauty and the bounty of our region, and we encourage everyone to love the veggies, and we share that love as much as we possibly can. So that's our model, and there's all kinds of different gleaning efforts. There's all kinds of networks and partnerships and scale. There are organizations and there are individuals out here doing this work. So when I say we, I mean either gleaners in general or the Gleaning Project. We don't waste growers' time, and we don't make any more work for you. We fit as seamlessly as possible within your production and distribution schedules to capture whatever you can't make money on. And we make you feel really good about it, and we give you as much beautiful, positive publicity as possible. And we grow a following in your community of engaged, community-minded, fresh fruit and vegetable interested, local food lovers, and converts, and tell them often how great that you are, and how to support our local growers best and where to buy your stuff. We also keep track of all donations for your tax deduction purposes. So to answer some of those questions or some of those obstacles that growers might have about gleaning, those that were identified in the earlier poll question, liability is almost always the first one that comes up. Almost always. So the Bill Emerson Charitable Food Donation Act was passed in 1996. The language of that bill is attached to this webinar. It's probably the most poorly publicized bit of federal legislation ever. This bill, passed in 1996, achieved really strong bipartisan support because it makes a lot of sense, covers all businesses that donate apparently wholesome food to 501c3 nonprofit organizations for distribution to individuals in need. So that's kind of the technical language. Essentially what it is a federal shield law that protects both the donor, so that would be any grower, any restaurant, any market, and the receiving agency, as long as it's a 501c3 nonprofit, from civil or criminal liability should food donated in good faith later cause harm to a recipient. That's except in cases of gross negligence. So unless you or I are willfully, grossly negligent with food safety, and as long as the donation is made to a 501c3 nonprofit, you cannot be held liable if someone gets sick from gleaning. With regards to physical injury and that kind of liability on your property, all of our volunteers sign additional liability waivers before they're allowed out of the glean machine. And that's the glean machine. When it comes to extra time, I don't think, if I do my job right and I try as hard as I can to do my job right, gleaning is not something that takes extra time from growers. It does take extra thought. So that perspective shift is what we're working towards addressing now. That takes time. That's really the only thing that a gleaner is going to ask for from a grower, is just that thought. And I'm really grateful to PASA and to Tracy in particular for organizing this webinar and inviting me to speak to have an opportunity to share about this. So our gleaning project merely needs growers to keep potential donations in mind when they're looking at their fields and they're looking at their storage, and just answer your phone or shoot us a text back once every week or every other week when we call during the season to say hi, you know, hope you're doing well, and just briefly ask if there's any gleaning for us to pick or for us to pick up. So this is a picture of a grower coming back from a market, had a great market, but also had a glut of Yas peppers. She also had some gleaning in her field. And this sentiment down at the bottom, basically that that gleaning makes her feel so much better about these extras because she knows that they're not going to waste, is an awesome value for us to be able to deliver to growers, which I think is worth that extra thought. After that, we essentially do everything else. We provide the labor and the container and the transport for any donations. As far as volunteers on your property, all of our volunteers sign liability waivers before they're allowed out of the glean machine. All our volunteers get a safety chat and the 3 rules of gleaning. We usually stretch. We always strategize with our gleaning coordinators before we go to work. We work together. We take care of each other, and we almost always have a great time.
Okay, Jay, I think we do have some questions here for you.
Okay, totally. I'm happy to.
Okay. And as folks may be starting to realize, a lot of this is going to start to overlap in terms of tax deductions and food safety and liability, et cetera. So when the questions sort of overlap, we're going to save that till the end when we can open it up to all of our presenters. But specifically, Jay, we have, does the gleaning project travel outside of Franklin and Adams County? And on a similar note, are you aware of any projects in Lancaster that are similar?
Definitely. So we travel outside of Franklin and Adams a little bit. I work with the grower in Smithsburg, Maryland, which is just south of Franklin County. Basically it's just a kind of a cost-benefit question for us, but we really do focus on Franklin and Adams because there's plenty here. In Lancaster, I'm happy to follow up with whoever asked that question. I have a couple contacts. There's a guy named John Mackley who's doing this on his own. There's also a retired state senator that's interested in starting a gleaning project or working with hunger. And there's a couple coalitions, and I'm happy to send that follow-up information to people that are curious about Lancaster. It seems like there's a lot of activity happening there, and things will coalesce pretty soon.
Okay. I don't know how close you were to the end of your presentation there, Jay. Is it okay if we move on to Winifred?
Yep, absolutely. Not a problem at all. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Jay, and thanks, Tracy. Jay, if you can transition over to Winifred.
Got it.
I'll now introduce our last presenter, which is Winifred McGee with Penn State Extension, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about how to potentially turn some of these produce seconds into some value-added products. So Winifred began her Penn State career at the Harrisburg Small Business Development Center in 1987. She joined Extension in 1990 as the state's first small and home-based business agent. Her focus continues to be food enterprise and agribusiness support and development as co-leader of the Penn State Outreach Keystone Kitchens Incubator project team. She researched shared kitchen incubators and developed a list of best management practices for sustainability. She is currently the coordinator for a project to expand Extension's agricultural entrepreneurship outreach to Hispanic clientele. The state coordinator for Penn State's branded Food Profit program and an instructor for the Extension programs of Farm Sense, Your Future in Focus, and Exploring the Small Farm Dream. So I'll turn it over to Winifred.
Okay, and I'll just ask if you can hear me now because I've had to change speakers.
Yes, we can, and thanks for doing that.
Great, thank you very much. And I was very glad when Tracy asked me to speak a couple minutes about a project that is really just ramping up in Pennsylvania right now. For the last couple of years, I have worked with a colleague down in West Virginia because there is a lot of concern about the amount of fresh fruit, especially that just stays on trees or ends up being dropped and not picked up off the ground, especially those that stay on trees simply because a lot of the processing plants have gone on. So we've really been looking at making use of that fresh fruit in relation to value-added products, and that's a project that we're moving on into Pennsylvania now that I want to talk about just for a few minutes. As you've heard in some of the previous presentations or maybe other presentations that you've been involved in, there are expenses related to the Food Safety Modernization Act compliance. There's new equipment that needs to be purchased in some cases. There are new practices that need to be put in place on farms. There's record keeping that needs to be done to ensure that your GAP-GIP certification or whatever else is intact and your practices are in coordination each time. There may be some new training that's involved for you or for your workers, and there's new habit building, and everyone gets a little bit disconcerted, I think, about building new habits, but that's part of it too. The sad thing is that none of these things that have some actual monetary cost as well as some emotional cost mean that you're necessarily going to get a perfect product, or that 100% of your products will be sold. It means that your products are qualifying for certain safety standards, but not necessarily that you're going to get the most from that investment that you've made with your dollars. I had asked for us to do a little bit of a poll right now.
Yes, Winifred, I'll go ahead and launch that for you right now.
Okay, if you could. And the reason why I'd asked this question about people having ever dried fruit and vegetables is sort of an old technique that has come back into vogue in recent times, and it's something that we're very interested in exploring, and that they've been very, very interested in exploring down in West Virginia in the project I've worked at previously.
Okay, we have quite a few people have voted, so I think we can close this out and I can tell you what the results are now. 58% have said yes from their home, 8% have said yes commercially.
Okay. And no no's. Well, that is good news for me, because that's what I want to talk about through the next few minutes. One of the use of the seconds, it would be the ugly fruit or the fruit that just doesn't get sold at the market stand or wherever you're retailing the food product, is to dry the excess fruit and vegetables. It is a method that appeals in a lot of different ways, especially economically, because it's a fairly simple processing strategy. It requires inexpensive packaging. When I look at people who package in jars, or people who develop some type of reduced oxygen packaging, then that gets to be a little bit pricey. The packaging that you need for dried fruit and vegetables is fairly simple and fairly inexpensive. It only requires dry storage, so you're not going to have to worry about climate control quite as readily. You're not going to have to worry about finding enough freezer space, enough refrigeration for a product. It's fairly inexpensive when you ship it, because again, in comparison to jars, there's a lot less weight there, and the bags of product can be moved fairly quickly. And it does allow you to use it all versus discarding leftovers, because the research that's been done, especially down in West Virginia University, has shown that you can have a product that is a high quality dried product. Apples that still have some bend to them. They're not apple chips necessarily, but some nice bend to them. And other products that look like the original, where you bind the water rather than remove all the water from the product. Those products still have a shelf life of a year or more in comparison to the fresh product, which will have only a matter of weeks or months before it's beyond prime. There are a couple of different ways you can go about doing the drying of fruit and vegetable. If you want to do it as an individual enterprise, and I would suspect those 50% who answered and said they'd done it for their own purposes already have a dryer like we're picturing here. Small tabletop dryer is going to run you $200 to $300. You're going to have to do a lot of batches through it if you're concentrating on using this for all of your seconds and you have a substantial amount that you want to take care of. There are additional costs in relation to business registration, but frankly, when you're looking at Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Food Safety, drying can be done because dried product is considered a not potentially hazardous food, or not TCS, time and temperature controlled for safety. So it is not one of those products. It can be done in a limited food establishment, which is basically a home kitchen that qualifies for being able to use it for your food business. And home kitchens have an initial inspection, and the inspection is free, and then it's $35 a year. So the business registration is not a considerable expense for being able to set up this individual enterprise. You need to think about the time it's going to take you in relation to drying the material, and get any kind of hands-on training you might need for accelerated drying methods that are going to produce a quality product that is going to be more saleable than perhaps the standard apple chip would be. You need to think about the hours of labor. If it is like I saw in some of the pictures in the previous presenter, where there is product that has not been taken out of the field yet, there's going to be some harvesting time related to it. There's going to be actual hours working with the preparing for the dryer, and then actually working with drying the product, and then there's packaging and sales. So it's not that there isn't some time you're going to need to spend. It's simply that you're going to have to take that time into consideration. Another method that is promising to me is the whole idea of forming a collaborative and actually getting a larger dryer that would be able to be used. The dryer that I have that is in the picture here, and I'm sorry the picture's not more sharp for you, but that dryer runs that $5,656 that I have up at the top of the slide. If you had simply 12 farmers who all wanted to collaborate, the share would be under $500 a piece to be able to get that basic dryer. And then the additional cost would be establishing and equipping a kitchen. Obviously, if you have a dryer of this size, you need to have it in some type of commercial kitchen. But when I say commercial kitchen, it can be a fire hall that you're using. It could be a church kitchen where they would have space and they would allow you to have it. There are a number of different places where you could have it. You need to hire someone who would be able to staff and work with it, because this capacity of this particular dryer is substantial enough that it probably will be more time than you as a farmer will want to spend doing the dried product yourself. And so having someone who is trained to be able to use it and collect it together would be an important consideration. Having somebody who can market on part of the cooperative would be an important step as well. And then there are still those hours of harvesting and transporting to the facility and picking up from the facility if you're going to pick up. But with this collaborative operation, I'm really thinking you're looking more at something similar to looking for wholesale opportunities for the dried product rather than the retail that you would do for the individual enterprise that I addressed in the previous slide. I think we have another question.
Yes, I'll go ahead and launch that for you.
Okay. My question here was just, if you were really going to move into drying, would your collaboration be whole way or just part way? And so that's what I was interested in finding out from folks who are attending this meeting today.
Again, if we could have a few more people vote, that'd be fantastic. Right now, it looks like we have approximately 17% saying marketing, 17, oh, no, it just changed dramatically there. We have about 14% production, 14% marketing, 14% both, and 57% neither.
Okay. The whole idea behind partial collaboration then, where we were talking about maybe doing production, would be the whole idea of one person being able to know all of the food safety standards and knowing the practices needed in order to make a high quality dried product. Getting it out into the marketplace is an important consideration, and the marketing of dried fruit, especially if you're doing it in bulk, to people who make granola, for instance, to people who make cereal products, and the cereal companies, even small boutiques, cereal companies are looking for enough of volume. It might not be just one producer, and that's why I'm saying maybe that partial collaboration in marketing would be an important thing. It means better use of yields, perhaps, to be able to do that collaboration. and better payback for the compliance that you're already putting in place in relation to your GAP-GIP certification in making the product and producing the product. As I said when I started this presentation, we're moving on into a pilot phase, and the pilot phase will be at the Greater Johnstown Career and Technology Center. They have a commercial kitchen there. They have a number of students who are really interested in learning about food production and local food production rather than doing their co-op time at the local McDonald's or the local Pizza Hut or someplace else. So we really want to have them work at developing value-added products as well and work with the farmers. They did purchase that commercial food dryer that I showed on one of the previous slides, the collaborative one, and it has been installed and they're working to get ready for use. We do have WVU faculty who are going to be providing producers as well as the students themselves training for advanced drying methods through this project. And the students will then be able to do some co-packing if the agricultural producer simply wants to drop off fruit or vegetable and have it dried, or assist side by side with the farmer who wants to come in and do some of his own. I say his because we do have one of our pilot producers already who really wants to dry zucchini. And I'm not certain about where and how he'll be able to market a lot of dried zucchini, because I don't see dried zucchini as one of those things that people have regularly seen before. One of the nice things too, though, is that the students are going to have a recipe contest and come up with some recipes for the dried zucchini as part of the marketing efforts. So there's co-packing, there's assistance with marketing, there'd be assistance with label development on the part of the students because they have visual aid people there as well, and it will be launching in May or June of this year. We're still soliciting some farmer interest, so I'd be very interested in hearing from you if you're interested in knowing more about this project, and especially if Johnstown is within a commuting distance for you. I will say too that this project is the pilot that will start out a larger project where we're going to be looking at several other locations across the state where there might be a dryer put in as well, and we will be looking for, similar to the CTC, a place where there could be some steady labor supplied for getting some collaborative drying projects up off the ground. If you're interested in that Johnstown project, here's my information, my name, my email address, and the phone number where I can be reached, and I'd be glad to talk to you further about this particular opportunity in adding value.
Okay, Winifred?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make certain we didn't lose you. Are we now going to open it up for questions? Wanted to make certain you were done with your presentation.
I am done with my presentation.
Okay.
Go ahead and change presenter.
Okay. I think back to Michelle, perhaps.
Yeah, you can go ahead and do that one, Fred. Thanks.
Okay. And I apologize to the folks that asked some questions of Jeff. So Jeff, I hope hope you're still there. We do have a couple that related back to what you were talking about, and they are kind of specific. So more about GAP compliance. So if you could tie in perhaps some of the costs related to these questions, that'd be great too. We had one person ask, does your hand washing station need to have hot water? And also a question about when FSMA became law and when its people have to become compliant.
Okay. The first question, does your hand washing station need to contain hot water? The answer is no, it doesn't need hot water. It needs to have soap. It needs to have single-use towels. They don't like hand towels that we all use in our bathrooms. Of course, if you have single-use towels, then you have to have a bathroom. And you also have to have a sign there that says, like you see in all the restaurants and everywhere else, that employees must wash hands before returning to work. Even if we're going out in the field and picking rotten onions out of the ground, we need to start off with clean hands, so we don't have any bacteria there to start with. The other question pertained to FSMA and when the regulations started. The regulations, the law was passed in January of 2011. The regulations were finalized in November of 2015. So all growers, let me start off this way, I guess. Small growers less than $250,000 in produce sales have 4 years to comply. If you're $250,000 to $500,000 in sales, you have 3 years to comply. Anybody over $500,000 in sales has 2 years to comply. And there is an extra 2 years to comply with the water restrictions, the water testing requirements. So most of the small growers that I work with have 4 years, basically, I think from January 1 of this year, so they would have to comply by the beginning of January 2020, but it depends on your size. Growers that, and there's a number of exemptions, I won't get into a lot of it, but growers who grow less than $25,000 in produce sales are exempt from the regulations, and the regulation does not cover produce that is typically cooked. So there's a whole list of things, some of which are eaten raw, but the list includes things like asparagus, beets, collards, winter squash, potatoes. Anything that's typically not eaten raw is exempt from FSMA.
Okay, I had a question. I wanted to clarify the picture of the apples that have fallen from the tree and landed on the ground. I was wondering, Jeff, if maybe you could speak a little bit more about that as an example of something that perhaps does not fit with GAP certification, and then if the rest of the gang could chime in on, just to cover the ground again, what could be done with those apples?
Right. So actually, the issue of apple drops was actually covered under the juice HACCP law probably 10 years ago, that first started to regulate the cider growers, required pasteurizing of cider. That said at that point that you could not use apples that dropped from the tree. In fact, the food safety law, well, at least with the audits, we have to write into our audit plans that food that is normally not grown in contact with the ground should not contact the ground, or it would need to be discarded. So something like a tomato that falls onto the ground, or a pepper, would need to be discarded. An onion, obviously not, because that typically grows in contact with the ground. Cantaloupes, things like that. So there are, as I listen, I'm talking a little bit about gleaning. I mean, there are some things there that under Food Safety Modernization Act, I'm not sure exactly where gleaning would fall, but there are some things when it comes to culls that it seems like we'll be generating more culls, I think, as a result of the Food Safety Modernization Act. So that may be a bit of a concern. The one thing I would say on that, the one issue that, and it's a small issue with gleaning, but visitors also need to be trained, or at least to be aware of the requirements for hand washing, not to be in the fields when you're sick. So gleaners, many audits and potentially buyers would consider gleaners to be a risk area. Not that to say that you couldn't do it, but you would have to come up with a training program for those folks to mitigate that risk, which again isn't a big deal, but it would have to be documented, and you would have to have a training log for all the folks who enter your field.
Definitely. Yeah, Jeff, I appreciate those points. And I might follow up with you about drops and food safety. My impression would be that the Bill Emerson Act would blanket statement that as long as it was donated for free handout to folks that are needy. As far as volunteer training, one of our previous gleaning coordinators was employed by Extension working on food safety, and so we use the same kind of field worker manuals to educate all of our volunteers before they go into the fields about food safety. Just to say that it definitely is something to pay attention to, but it's not an insurmountable obstacle.
Right, and it's not that, like you said, it's not a big issue. It's just something that it's another record that farmers would have to keep, but it's nothing that I mean, like you said, you could bring that log along to the farm. That farmer could put that in his records. It would be as simple as that. In fact, it probably wouldn't even take that much of the farmer's time, but it's certainly something that auditors would question. But yeah.
Jay, a question for you. You did mention that you guys keep a record of donations for tax purposes. Could you speak a little bit more about what that looks like and how that works?
Definitely, yeah. So really briefly, gleaning, donating produce to a nonprofit like the Gleaning Project or like SCAP is essentially, well, it's like taking clothes to say Goodwill. Essentially the same idea. We write out an in-kind donation. That donation is valued whatever the grower values it at. Usually we hold on to all of that paperwork until the end of the calendar year, so that our growers don't have to bother with filing away. And then at the end of December 2016, this year, we'll send all our receipts to our individual growers. Just recently, in December, there was a passage of a bill. It's called the PATH Act, which incentivizes small and mid-sized farms, particularly produce farms, to donate more of their produce to programs like the Gleaning Project. So now all small businesses, including LLCs and sole proprietorships, can take an enhanced tax deduction very easily for donation of excess wholesome food. I think they can receive tax benefits for donated food up to 15% of their adjusted gross income, and donors that use cash basis accounting can now take that enhanced tax deduction as well. So at the federal level, there's some movement in terms of incentivizing more of this food waste reduction, but also hunger mitigation by donating excess produce to qualified nonprofits. Yeah, I think that's it. The Gleaning Project has a website, thegleaningproject.org, and we also have a blog, and I'll have a blog post up about that tax change early next week if anyone's interested.
Okay, and Winifred, I have one last question for you. The cooperative drying, has any of those ever been set up at food banks?
I'm not aware that any has been set up at a food bank, but that is an interesting idea to be able to draw it. As I said, this is just something that we're launching here in Pennsylvania, and I haven't heard of them doing any of that in West Virginia in the last couple of years when I've been working with them in the project down there. It would just take being able to set up the appropriate processing space, and really the registration for that business enterprise would not be any more expensive than a home enterprise would. So sounds like a good idea.
Okay, and we're back to the apples, and hopefully, Jeff, you'll also share the new guidelines about apples and livestock, but the specific question is about the apples falling from the trees and being required to be discarded. So you're saying it's not possible to wash those apples and still continue to press them for cider?
Right, especially with, yeah, and to sell that, yeah, that would be a problem. I think, and I'm not as familiar with the juice HACCP rules, but I know that was one of the things that most commercial growers had to stop doing. One of the things that they tell us with sanitizing and cleaning is that the reason we put sanitizer in our wash water is not to kill bacteria on the produce, it's to keep the bacteria from spreading in that water to other produce. So I've been told that while we can get some reduction in pathogens on produce with sanitizers, we cannot get a complete 5-log reduction, which is our standard of pathogens. So even though you wash that fruit at home, and that's still a good idea, it's not considered a like a kill step like cooking would be. So yeah, that's correct. And that's the way I understand the juice HACCP laws, is those apples cannot be cleaned or sanitized well enough to go into juice.
And you had mentioned to me earlier about, I think it was under FSMA, that, and we're picking on apples, but you even mentioned tomatoes, things that were not normally grown in the ground. There might now be some rulings as it applies to feeding that to your livestock.
Yeah, and so there's 5 parts to the FSMA law. The produce safety rule is the part that applies to farmers, and that's the one I'm the most knowledgeable on. The preventative controls is what Winifred was talking about. But there is also a separate section that covers livestock feed, and I haven't looked at that in detail. You could probably still feed that to cattle. Now I'm getting into the without having looked at that in detail. I know, for example, like a supermarket or a processing company that has food waste. For example, they can't just leaves the trimmings from lettuce, a head of lettuce. If you pull the outer leaves off, you can't throw that in a dumpster and then take it and feed it to a cow. You have to maintain that product just like you would if you were shipping it to a human customer. So they are requiring some kind of, they are taking a look at how you handle your waste food that goes to cattle. I wouldn't say that you couldn't feed drops to cows, but they were, yeah, I'd have to look at that a lot closer before I could give you a concrete answer on that.
And I think we'll have this as the last question. I'm going to combine the two here. It's still these poor apples that we're picking on. Winifred, we had one person comment, according to my understanding, apple drops can still be utilized in sauce or apple butter. And another person asked about what if the apples have been put through UV pasteurization after they've dropped to the ground.
To put it into applesauce and other product like that?
Right, apples that have been dropped. I think the question, I mean, we can extend it beyond apples. Let's say the tomatoes that have dropped to the ground into tomato sauce or something. So is there more leeway if you're processing? If you're cooking?
Common sense would tell me yes. Based on what I know, I do know that I would have to do a little bit more research on that to be able to give you a definitive answer, because the area that I work in is more the development of the business aspect than the food safety. I have a partner that works in the area of food safety in particular that we'd have to ask the question of. But further processing should provide some consideration of the food safety aspect. And you were talking about UV. I am not sure about UV.
I know there is some, if there's a kill step in the processing, then it's, yeah, then there's a lot more leeway. For example, tomatoes. Of course, some tomatoes are grown in contact with the ground if we're talking processing tomatoes. And I know, like Fermanos, which has a number of farmers around that grow processing tomatoes for them, they have a documented kill step in their procedure, cooking or blanching at temperature or something that allows their folks to have a lot more leeway as far as that goes.
Okay, I think that is the end of our questions. Michelle?
Okay, thanks so much. Well, thank you, Tracy, for all your work on this grant and pulling this presentation together. Thanks to Jeff, Nikki, Jay, and Winifred, and thanks for everyone for attending. To all the attendees, we will be sending out a follow-up email with a link to a survey. We'd appreciate you taking a few minutes of your time to give us some feedback as PASA looks to continue to offer webinars and increase our programming around that. So we'll also include the handouts, as I mentioned, that were available for download, and we will include everyone's contact information that was part of the presentation today. So if there's nothing else, thanks so much, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.